None of this was ever going to happen. I mean, Donald Trump, for all his many faults, was consistently saying, look, we're not interested in being a backstop in this. This has nothing to do with us. We're not going to participate. And yet the European powers continued to work on the basis that that would be in place. And the idea that we could commit tens of thousands of troops was completely fantastical.
With me to discuss the rise and perhaps fall of a plan to have European boots on the ground in Ukraine is Eliot Wilson, a defence commentator and writer. Eliot, afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It feels like this idea came along in a big rush. What exactly was being mooted by these allies?
Well, it's all been very strange. The idea of a coalition of the willing that Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron really pioneered came very suddenly after it was made very clear to European powers that, America was no longer really that committed to European security and was going to scale back its commitment, particularly in terms of supplying Ukraine with military aid. And as soon as that happened, there was a sort of lurch forward in the European position of saying, right, well, as soon as there's a peace agreement, because at that point there was some sort of desultory peace negotiation going on, we'll supply some sort of peacekeeping force, partly to enforce whatever is agreed, but also partly, I think, to keep European powers in the game. But the strange thing about it was that it came along before there was any peace agreement, and of course there still is no peace agreement, and yet it became a very detailed plan almost, without any purpose when it was first devised.
And quite soon those plans were scaled back. The security guarantees they were talking about, the thousands of troops, would just be air support, maybe a no-fly zone. What stopped those grand plans, the thousands of troops, from actually being realised?
I think, in truth, it was a hard collision with reality. There was a sort of rush of blood to the head, and initially I think the UK was talking about committing maybe 25,000 troops or 15,000 troops, which is far more than we have the capacity to put on the ground. And they were also relying on the fact that there would be what they were calling an American backstop, by which they mean essentially support in terms of reconnaissance, possibly logistics, but also, if everything else failed, that the Americans would perhaps provide air power for sort of punitive strikes against Russia if they broke the agreement. But none of this was ever going to happen. I mean, Donald Trump, for all his many faults, was consistently saying, look, we're not interested in being a backstop in this. This has nothing to do with us. We're not going to participate. And yet the European powers continued to work on the basis that that would be in place. And the idea that we could commit tens of thousands of troops was completely fantastical. The entire army, the British army, is now about 73,000 people. And we were talking about committing maybe a third of that to a peacekeeping effort in Ukraine before there was a peace to keep. So it was all really a sort of great idea on paper, got quite a lot of headlines, garnered a lot of coverage for Starmer and Macron. But then when it hit what was actually feasible, there was just no way it could proceed on that basis.
You very early on predicted the plans would come to nothing, even the phrase doomed to fail. How does it feel looking back being proved quite so right?
It doesn't provide an enormous sense of satisfaction because, this is something governments should have known and indeed must have known. There is no way that the Prime Minister can have been sitting in Downing Street working out plans like this and nobody told him, actually, this is based on complete fantasy. There is a degree to which, in his public pronouncements, the Prime Minister and his ministers are guilty occasionally of putting the best spin on things, working on the very best of assumptions, or sort of saying in the background, well, if this and this happen, then we can do this. But, in practical terms, he must have known better than I, frankly, given his advice and intelligence available, that this was not going to happen. And I think there is a worry that for political reasons, he and Emmanuel Macron surged ahead, trying to keep themselves involved in the geopolitics and keep themselves relevant, but knew all the time that they were pursuing a strategy which, in the terms in which they were presenting it, was just not going to happen.
So there was a sense the public meetings, the pronouncements, the promises were for a reason, not just because they came to the realization they couldn't deliver. This was for some other reason.
I think there must have been a huge communications driver behind it, because it wasn't just that in logistical and practical terms, we weren't able to generate the sort of forces that we needed. But there was also a slightly weird disconnect because the governments, particularly Britain and France, were talking in more and more detail about what this coalition of the willing would be, what kind of force it would be, what kind of precise operations it would conduct. And all the time, there was no peace agreement in Ukraine. There still is no peace agreement in Ukraine. There is no prospect of a peace agreement in Ukraine. And yet they were making plans as if that was pretty much a done deal. Now, we've seen that, Vladimir Putin is not interested in any kind of peace agreement that doesn't massively favor Russia. Why should he be, from a very cynical point of view? And Donald Trump, until recently, seemed to think that he had some mystical ability through his chosen instrument, Steve Witkoff, in creating a deal where there hadn't been one before. And, I don't think many people really thought that there was going to be an equitable solution to the problem. And yet, the coalition of the willing was proceeding as if that was almost a sort of formality, a done deal. That that was fine, that was put to bed, and now we can think about how we deal with the practicalities.
In terms of practicalities, the French President Emmanuel Macron and the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer today have agreed to order more Storm Shadows that are used in Ukraine and to work on new anti-drone weapons. They say that they'll keep working together using what Starmer described as their shared might. Can Britain and France, in the absence of the US backstop that we've talked about, actually make a difference to Ukraine?
In terms of securing some kind of settlement, no, I don't think we can. There is a role for Britain and France and Germany, which is also spending a lot of money. I mean, let's not forget that Germany is committed to a borrowing capacity of something like €500 billion or getting there, both to modernise the Bundeswehr, but also to contribute to European security. There is a lot that Europe can do, and Europe is going to need to do more, because we've seen in recent weeks that last week the US halted supplies of military assistance to Ukraine. That's now been partly restarted by President Trump. But what we know, and what we should always have known, is that President Trump is not a reliable ally anymore in Ukraine. And Europe is going to have to be prepared to step up. America has given a huge amount of support to Ukraine. It's given, I think, something like $140 billion over the past 3 years. But Europe has pulled its weight, and Britain has pulled its weight. We are going to need to do more if we are serious about the kind of commitments we've made to Ukraine, because we've talked in very, very high-sounding terms about, we support Ukraine for as long as it takes, whatever they need. If we're serious about that, and I think we need to be, because the survival of Ukraine is important for Europe, then we're going to need to put more resources behind it. We're going to need to work closer together. And, it's important that Sir Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are talking about that at the moment. Let's hope we can get something worthwhile and tangible out of this visit and out of the deals that they've done. But we do need to be realistic about what we have the capacity to provide, because otherwise we're misleading ourselves, we're misleading Ukraine, which is deeply unfair, and we're also misleading the electorate.
In terms of those extra resources you mentioned, European NATO allies have agreed to bump defence spending up to that 5%. In a few years, is there a scenario where those European countries could feasibly provide some kind of effective deterrence force or a fighting force?
I think it's difficult. The problem with any kind of peacekeeping force, which is essentially still what we're talking about, though I think a peace deal is increasingly unlikely, is that you need to be able to enforce it in one of two ways. Either you need to be able to rely on the other partner that they will abide by it, and we know that we can't trust President Putin on that. We know that he's unreliable. He will do exactly what is in his own interests. He will not stick to a deal he never has. So we can discount that. The other option is you need to be able to inflict punitive measures, or at least threaten to inflict punitive measures to a degree whereby the other party doesn't break the terms of the agreement. Now, that is going to be difficult, because ultimately, if you unwind that to its logical conclusion, that means starting a war with Russia over infringements of a peace deal on Ukraine. I think what is more practical, though it's still a considerable task, is to get European capacity up to a degree where Russia is deterred from starting any kind of conflict because it worries about the consequences. Now, that's tough, because we've seen that Vladimir Putin is not particularly worried about consequences in terms of Russian casualties. We saw recently that Russia has now lost 1 million men dead or injured in its war in Ukraine in just over 3 years, which is an unimaginable loss of life in this day and age. But more spending is good. The NATO summit was encouraging in pushing for that target of 5%, although there are qualifications around that. And we also need to think about exactly how it is that we're going to deter Russia directly, whether it's in terms of putting them off from conducting hybrid warfare, which is something that the House Commons Defence Committee published a report on this week, and also putting enough forces on NATO's eastern flank to make a serious Russian invasion a very expensive business for the Kremlin.
This idea, the discussion around it, happened very, very publicly, hard to avoid given there were 31 countries involved at one point. How do you think Russia will be looking at the kind of rise and fall of this idea?
I think the important thing, this is something I've said all along, is that the key to understanding Vladimir Putin is that he used to be a KGB officer. And that's how he works. It's how he's always worked. And it's the mentality that he brings to statecraft. So he looks for weakness. He looks for the ability to influence and to coerce. And he will be, in most ways, very, very coldly rational about what is happening. There are some signs in recent years that perhaps his judgment has started to become more idealistic, or in his own head idealistic, than rational. But he will have been perfectly aware that there was no possibility of NATO or a coalition of the willing or any kind of force putting 20, 30, 40,000 troops into Ukraine. And of course, he and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, said very clearly that would be a red line for Russia. That would be unacceptable. Russia is still operating essentially on its war ends in Ukraine. They want no Western presence in Ukraine. They want Ukraine to rule out its membership of NATO. They effectively want to veto over Ukraine's foreign relations. And he will have known that there was not a serious prospect of a major ground force being put in place. And he will also be very aware that there are still tensions or anxieties between European members of NATO and between the United States. He is also very aware that, although Donald Trump is now talking about tougher sanctions, we saw recently when the arms shipments to Ukraine were suspended that in the past week we've had 3 of the heaviest air raids of the war on Ukraine, hundreds and hundreds of drones and missiles. And Putin knows exactly when to turn up the pressure. He's in this for the long haul, partly because he can't afford to lose, but also because he is, by some very bloody and mechanistic standards, he's doing quite well in Ukraine. Not as well as he'd hoped, but quite well. And, he doesn't have to worry about elections. He's got no electoral cycle to worry about. He can plan for 3, 4, 5 years ahead. So I think he'll be comfortable with the situation at the moment. And there is no real inducement on him to reach a settlement anytime soon.
That coalition of the willing meets again today. Do you think it's a worthwhile use of those leaders' time, especially given, as you say, we don't have a peace settlement to defend?
I think it depends on what they're expecting from it. If they want some kind of sort of communications push, if they want to reinforce in the public mind the fact that they're united and that they are supporting Ukraine, that's fine. That's a good thing to do. It's fine to rally around the sort of Ukrainian flag and say, we are with you. We're with you till the end. But it's important that they don't mislead their electorates, because people are taking a greater interest in defence than I've known since the Cold War. But people's attention spans are short, of course. People don't take much interest in politics. We understand that. And so I think it's very important that people don't think, oh, well, Ukraine is now solved. We're going to go in and we'll sort it all out and then that'll be off our radar. It's still a very, very bloody conflict, which is not decided one way or the other. We may have to, both Britain and our European partners, put significant resources into it. And yes, it's good that we're saying we're committed, but we also need to make it clear to our electorates that this is going to be tough and that it won't be decisive, at least for some time to come.